She stood on that platform, suitcase in hand, heart full of hope, and watched the man who hired her turn his back the moment she opened her mouth. Not because she was wrong. Not because she was unqualified. Because of the way her words sounded. One accent. That was all it took to close every door in Red Hollow, Montana. But one man, a quiet cowboy with calloused hands and steady eyes, heard something everyone else refused to hear. If this story touches your heart, please subscribe and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The train had barely stopped rolling when Elena Varga felt the first stare. It came from a boy, couldn't have been more than 12 years old, standing at the edge of the platform, with his mother watching the passengers step down from the passenger car. He wasn't cruel about it. Boys that age rarely are not intentionally. He simply pointed at Elena and tugged his mother's sleeve and said loudly enough for 3 rows of people to hear, "Mama, why does that lady look so lost?" His mother shushed him, but not before Elena caught every word. She squared her shoulders, adjusted the handle of her small leather suitcase, and reminded herself what her own mother had told her the morning she left Budapest. "You are not lost, Elena. You are arriving." She believed that. She had to believe that, because the alternative that she had crossed 2,000 miles of ocean and another 1,000 miles of American railroad to arrive somewhere she was already unwanted was simply too heavy to carry. Red Hollow, Montana Territory, in the summer of 1878, was not a large town. It had 2 main streets, a general store, a livery stable, a church with a cracked bell, and a saloon that did more business than all of them combined. It smelled like sawdust and dry earth and horse sweat. It was the kind of town that had opinions about everything, who belonged, who didn't, who was worth trusting, and who wasn't. Elena had read about towns like this in the pamphlets. She had not fully believed them. She believed them now. She stood at the base of the platform steps and pulled the advertisement from her coat pocket. She had kept it folded against her chest for the entire journey, reading it so many times the creases had worn almost through. Seeking capable housekeeper for well-established ranch. Must be organized, reliable, and hard-working. Inquire at Brooks Ranch, Red Hollow, Montana Territory. Fair wages for the right person. She had written 3 letters before she received a reply. The reply said simply, "Position available. Present yourself at the station, Tuesday afternoon train." She had presented herself. Now she needed to find Nathaniel Brooks. She didn't have to search long. He found her. How was a broad man somewhere in his late 50s, wearing a hat that had been expensive once. He walked with the kind of authority that comes not from strength, but from habit. The habit of being the most important person in whatever room he entered. He had a foreman beside him, a younger man with narrow eyes who kept scanning the crowd as if he expected trouble. "You're the one who wrote from Chicago," Nathaniel Brooks said, looking at Elena the way a man looks at a purchase he's already regretting. "Yes, sir." Elena extended her hand. "Elena Varga, I am very pleased to meet—" He cut her off. Not with his words, with his face. The moment she spoke, something shifted in Nathaniel Brooks. His expression didn't fall, it closed, like a shutter snapping shut on a window. His eyes moved to his foreman, then back to her, and what passed between them was the kind of look men share when they think a woman isn't watching. "Where exactly are you from?" he asked. "Hungary, sir. But I have lived in Hungary." He said the word the way someone might say mud on a clean floor. "You didn't mention that in your letters." "I mentioned that I came from abroad. I mentioned that English was my second." "I can hear that," he said flatly. "I can hear that very clearly." The platform around them had not gone quiet. There were still passengers moving, porters calling out, children running. But the small circle around Elena and Nathaniel Brooks had developed a kind of private silence. The boy who'd pointed at her earlier was watching again. His mother was watching too. A woman in a blue bonnet near the ticket window had stopped pretending to read a notice board. Elena felt the weight of all those eyes. She stood straighter. "Mr. Brooks," she said carefully, keeping her voice steady. "I speak 3 languages. I have managed a household of 11 people. I understand farming. I understand record keeping. I understand how to care for the sick. I am a hard worker. I am honest. I came here because your advertisement asked for someone capable, and I am capable." Nathaniel Brooks looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You were supposed to sound American." Silence. The kind that lands on you like a stone dropped in still water. Elena had prepared for many things. She had prepared for the cold, for the distance, for the work being harder than described. She had prepared for homesickness, for loneliness, for the particular exhaustion of building something from nothing in a strange place. She had not prepared for that sentence. "You were supposed to sound American," as if her voice were a defect, as if the years she had spent learning this language, practicing it, reading it by candlelight in her father's house, as if all of that counted for nothing. The moment the words came out shaped by the tongue she was born with, she didn't cry. She wanted to. The feeling was there, sharp and immediate, pressing behind her eyes. But she had learned on the long journey from Budapest to Hamburg to New York to Chicago to here, that tears were a luxury she could rarely afford. Not in public, not in front of men like this. "I understand your concern," she said quietly. "But the work does not require an accent, Mr. Brooks. It requires skill. And skill I have." He reached into his coat pocket and produced 3 coins. He held them out between 2 fingers the way you might offer something to a dog you weren't sure about. "For your trouble," he said. "The position is no longer available." He didn't wait for her to respond. He simply turned and walked away, his foreman trailing behind him, and within 30 seconds they had both disappeared into the crowd, as if the entire exchange had never happened. Elena stood on the platform with 3 coins in her hand and nowhere to go. She walked. That was the only thing she knew how to do when everything else failed. Walk. Keep moving. Don't stop in one place long enough for despair to find the chair beside you and sit down. Red Hollow's Main Street was a long, sun-beaten stretch of storefronts and wooden sidewalks. Elena moved along it slowly, reading every sign, looking for anything that might suggest work. She passed a bakery, a dress shop, a hardware merchant, a woman selling vegetables from a cart who took one look at Elena and turned away before a single word was exchanged. She tried the bakery first. "I'm sorry," the woman behind the counter said, not sounding particularly sorry. "We're not hiring." The hardware merchant didn't even let her finish her sentence. "Can't understand you," he said. Next. The dress shop was worse. The owner, a thin woman with her hair pulled so tight it seemed to be causing her physical pain, listened to Elena for approximately 10 seconds before saying with the careful precision of someone choosing a weapon, "This is an American establishment. We serve American customers. I don't think you'd be a good fit." Elena stepped back out onto the wooden sidewalk. She stood there for a moment, letting the sun hit her face, feeling it warm through the exhaustion. 3 coins in her pocket. 1 suitcase. A worn Bible with her mother's handwriting in the margins. And a town that had decided in the span of one afternoon that her voice was a problem too large to overlook. She thought about the train. It had already gone. The next one wouldn't come through until Thursday. She had enough money for one night in a boarding house, maybe, if she could find one that would take her. She started walking again. She heard the screaming before she saw what caused it. It came from the far end of the street, a high, raw sound that cut through the ordinary noise of the afternoon. Then she heard it, the thunder of hooves, the grinding crack of wooden wheels, and the shouts of people scattering. Elena turned. 2 horses. A delivery wagon. The driver was gone. She couldn't see how or why, only that the wagon was unmanned and the horses were running wild-eyed and terrified straight down the center of the main street toward a group of people who had not yet understood the danger they were in. An older woman stood frozen near a post. A child had dropped his hoop in the middle of the road and was standing there staring transfixed. 3 men on the sidewalk were shouting at each other about what to do, none of them doing anything. Elena moved before she thought about it. That was simply who she was. Her grandfather had been a horse breeder. She had grown up around frightened animals. She knew the difference between a horse that wanted to harm you and a horse that was simply terrified, and these 2 animals were not angry, they were lost. They were running because they didn't know what else to do. She stepped into the street. "Hey!" She heard a man behind her call out. "Lady, get back." She didn't get back. She stepped directly into the path of the horses, not close enough to be trampled, Not so far that they couldn't see her, and she began to speak. Not in English, in Hungarian. She spoke the way her grandfather spoke, low and even and unhurried, the rhythm of it, like water moving over smooth stones. The words themselves didn't matter. She was telling the horses in the language she had first learned to love animals, in that they were safe, that the danger was over, that they could stop. The first horse noticed her when it was still 40 feet away. Its ears shifted. The frantic pumping of its legs began almost imperceptibly to slow. 30 feet. She kept talking, kept her body still, kept her hands low and open. 20 feet. The second horse followed the first. They were herd animals. They looked to each other. If one stopped trusting the fear, the other would too. 15 feet. The horses slowed to a canter, then a trot. Then 10 feet from where Elena stood, they stopped altogether. Their sides were heaving. Their eyes were still wide, but they were standing still, and the child in the middle of the road had been grabbed by a passing man and pulled to safety. And the old woman near the post had sat down hard on a bench and was pressing a hand to her chest. Elena walked the remaining distance to the horses and put her hand on the closest one's neck. She kept talking, kept her voice steady and low. Behind her she heard the town. It had gone completely silent. Then from somewhere to her left, a single person spoke. "I'll be." The voice was low, not loud, not performed. It was the voice of someone who had genuinely seen something he wasn't expecting and was honest enough to say so. Elena turned. Howe was standing apart from the crowd, which was typical of him. She'd learned that later. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, maybe older, with a face that had been weathered by years of outdoor work into something that was more character than handsomeness. He wore a work shirt and plain trousers and a hat that had clearly never been chosen for style. His hands were calloused. His boots were dusty. He was looking at her the way almost nobody in Red Hollow had looked at her since she arrived. Not with curiosity, not with suspicion, not with calculation, with straightforward, uncomplicated respect. "You didn't scare those horses," he said. Elena waited. "You reminded them they were safe." He paused. "Those are different things." She didn't know what to say. She had expected after the afternoon she'd had that he would follow up with something that turned the observation into a warning or a dismissal. She had already braced for it. It didn't come. "Caleb Turner," he said, and extended his hand. She shook it. "Elena Varga." The moment her accent landed on those two words, she watched his face for the familiar shift, the slight narrowing, the reassessment, the retreat behind politeness. It didn't happen. Caleb Turner simply nodded, as if her name were a perfectly ordinary thing to hear. "You looking for work, Miss Varga?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. She had answered that question too many times today. She had given it honestly, carefully, and completely, and every single time it had led nowhere but backward. "I am," she said. "Though I have found this afternoon that Red Hollow has particular requirements for employment." "Such as?" She met his eyes. "That the person speaking sounds as if they were born here." Something moved through Caleb Turner's expression. Not anger exactly. Something quieter than that. "I have a ranch," he said, "about 4 miles east of town. I need someone who understands animals, who can help manage supply records and assist my ranch manager, who's been slowing down considerably since last winter." He glanced at the two horses who were still standing calm under Elena's hand. "I can pay fair wages and provide a room. The work is hard. The hours are long." He stopped. Then, as an afterthought that wasn't an afterthought at all, "I don't have requirements about how a person sounds." Elena looked at him for a long moment. Behind her, the crowd on the street had slowly begun to dissolve, people drifting back to their interrupted afternoons. She could hear them talking. She caught fragments of words, the particular cadence of people discussing something they'd just witnessed. She wasn't certain if they were talking about the horses or about her. Probably both. "You don't know me," she said to Caleb Turner. "No," he agreed. "I know that you walked into the path of a runaway wagon to save a child and an old woman. Most people I know would have stayed on the sidewalk." He shifted his hat slightly. "That tells me something." It tells you I may be reckless." He almost smiled. Almost. "Or that you know what you're doing." Elena thought about the 3 coins in her pocket. She thought about 2 more nights before the next train. She thought about her mother's handwriting in the margins of the Bible. "You are not lost, Elena. You are arriving." "I accept," she said. The ride to the ranch was quiet. Caleb drove the wagon. Elena sat on the bench beside him with her suitcase between her feet. The land opened up around them wide and amber and enormous, the sky above it pressing down with a blue so deep it almost hurt to look at. And for the first time since she'd arrived in Red Hollow, Elena felt the particular tightness in her chest begin slightly to ease. She didn't know why. She had not yet earned the ease. Nothing was settled. Everything was still uncertain. But there was something in the silence of the man beside her that made space for her to breathe. Most silences she had encountered since coming to America were the silence of rejection. The silence after her accent landed while the other person reorganized their face. This was a different kind. It was simply the silence of a man who did not feel the need to fill every moment with words. She found after a lifetime of talking carefully in a language not her own that she appreciated that more than she could say. "How long have you had the ranch?" she asked. He thought about it for a moment as if calculating. 8 years. Bought it with a stake I saved working cattle drives down in Texas." He paused. "It's not large, but it's mine." "And your ranch manager?" "Tom Haverford. He's 63. Been with the ranch since before I bought it. His back has been giving him trouble since December." A brief pause. "He won't say he needs help, but he does." "He may not want me there," Elena said. It was not a question. "He might not," Caleb agreed. He didn't try to dress it up. "Tom's a fair man, but he's old-fashioned about some things. Give him time." Elena nodded. They were quiet again for a stretch. The wagon rolled on. Then Caleb said without looking at her, "Why Montana?" She was quiet for a moment, deciding how much truth to give. "I had family in Chicago," she finally said. "A cousin and his wife. I came over from Hungary 4 years ago and lived with them while I learned English. They were very kind to me, but—" She stopped. "But," he prompted gently. "But their lives were full, and mine was not yet started," she said. "I needed to build something for myself, not live in the corner of someone else's." She looked out at the land. The advertisement said Montana. It said hard work and fair wages. I thought— She stopped again. Caleb waited. "I thought if I worked hard enough," she said, "it would not matter where I was born." He was quiet for a beat. "It should not matter," he said finally. "That's the truth of it. It should not matter. But it does," she said. Not bitterly, just accurately. "In some places," Caleb said. To some people, he didn't say more than that, but he said it the way a man says something he means completely. The ranch appeared ahead of them as the light was shifting into that particular golden thickness of late afternoon. It was a modest place. A main house, a bunkhouse for the hands, a barn, several smaller outbuildings. Fences, a water trough. 2 dogs that materialized out of nowhere when the wagon rolled in and immediately began an investigation of Elena's boots. "Biscuit and Flint," Caleb said. "Ignore them and they'll calm down." Elena reached down and let the dogs smell her hand. They stopped barking immediately. "Or do that," Caleb said. A man emerged from the barn as they pulled up. He was exactly as described, older, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone whose back reminded him regularly of every choice it had ever had to make. He had a weathered, honest face and suspicious eyes that fixed on Elena the moment he saw her. "Tom," Caleb said as he climbed down from the wagon. "This is Elena Varga. She'll be helping with the household accounts and the supplies and assisting wherever else she's needed." Tom Haverford looked at Elena with the particular expression of a man who had not been consulted on a decision that affected him. "She's foreign," he said the way he might have said it might rain. "She is," Caleb said. "So were your grandparents, unless I'm misremembering." Tom had nothing to say to that. He turned and went back into the barn. Elena picked up her suitcase. "That's the best welcome he gave me too," Caleb said, "the first time I came through." Despite herself, Despite everything, Elena almost smiled. The room she was given was small: a cot, a washstand, a window with a hook latch. It was cleaner than she expected and warmer than anything she'd slept in for weeks. She set her suitcase down and took out the Bible and placed it on the windowsill. Outside, she could hear the ordinary sounds of the ranch settling into evening, the horses moving in the barn, the low voices of the ranch hands coming in from the fields, somewhere a door banging in a light wind. She sat on the edge of the cot. She had been in Red Hollow for less than one full day. She had been humiliated at the train station. She had been turned away from every business on the main street. She had walked into the path of a runaway wagon and talked horses back to standing still in the middle of a street while a whole town watched. And she had ended up here, in a small room on a quiet ranch with a man who hadn't flinched at her accent. She opened the Bible to the first page where her mother had written in careful Hungarian, "Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that something else is more important." She read it twice. Then she closed the Bible, lay back on the cot, and stared at the ceiling until sleep found her. The next morning, Elena began. She was up before sunrise. She had always been up before sunrise. In Hungary and Chicago, she had found that the hours before the rest of the world woke up were the ones that belonged entirely to her, the ones where she could be simply herself without the effort of translation. She went to the kitchen and built a fire and started coffee. When Caleb came downstairs, he stopped in the doorway. "I usually do that," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to be useful." He sat down at the table. She poured the coffee and sat across from him. Not because she felt she had the right to. She wasn't sure yet what rights she had here, but because she needed to establish from the beginning that she was not a servant. She was an employee. There was a difference. Caleb didn't seem to find anything wrong with it. "I'd like to see the supply records today," she said, "if that's possible. And the household accounts." "They're a mess," he said. "I'll warn you now." "Most records that need attention are a mess," she said. "That's why they need attention." He looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup. Not the calculating look she'd learned to dread. Something more like recognition. Like he was seeing something in her that made sense to him. "After breakfast," he said, "I'll show you where everything is." The records were indeed a mess. 3 years of supply receipts in no particular order. Livestock tallies that didn't match between 2 different notebooks. A ledger with entries in 3 different people's handwriting that sometimes contradicted each other within the same month. Tom Haverford stood in the corner of the small office and watched Elena work through the first box of receipts with the expression of a man waiting for something to go wrong. It didn't go wrong. She sorted. She organized. She asked specific questions when something was unclear, not helpless questions but precise ones. "This receipt is dated April, but the payment isn't recorded until June. Was that an error or a deliberate arrangement?" The kind of questions that came from someone who actually understood what they were looking at. By mid-morning, Tom had stopped leaning against the wall and moved without quite admitting it to stand closer to the desk. By noon, he had answered enough of her questions that he was essentially helping her. "You actually know what you're doing," he said at one point. He said it the way a man admits something he hadn't expected to. "I told you I did," Elena said. A pause. "You did," Tom agreed. It wasn't warmth exactly. It wasn't welcome. But it was something, and Elena knew well enough to take something when nothing had been available. By the end of the first week, she had reorganized the entire supply system. By the end of the second week, she had identified 3 suppliers who had been overcharging the ranch for 18 months, and she had drafted carefully in her clearest handwriting a set of corrected invoices to be sent out. Caleb read her work at the kitchen table one evening, going through each page in silence. Then he looked up. "You saved the ranch close to $200, he said. "Perhaps slightly more," Elena said. "I'm still working through the second ledger." He set the papers down. Looked at her for a moment. "Nobody ever did this before," he said. She held his gaze. "Nobody gave me the chance to." Something passed between them, quiet and brief and real. The kind of thing that doesn't need to be named to be understood. "Well," Caleb said finally, "you have the chance now." But Red Hollow had not forgotten about her. Word travels fast in a small territory, and the word that had traveled was this, that the foreign woman with the strange accent, the one Nathaniel Brooks had turned away at the station, was now living and working on the Turner Ranch. Some people found that amusing. Some found it troubling. And some, particularly, Nathaniel Brooks himself, found it something considerably darker than either. He heard about it at the saloon from his foreman, who had heard it from a hand who'd been at the livery when Caleb came in for supplies. "She's working for Turner." Nathaniel set down his glass. "Doing what? Records, supply accounts, that kind of thing." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. He picked up his glass again and turned it slowly in his hand. "Turner always was too particular about who he took advice from," he said finally. His foreman waited. "Keep an eye on it," Nathaniel said. "That woman doesn't know this valley the way we do, and people who don't know a valley sometimes stumble into things they shouldn't." It was said quietly, mildly, the way all the most dangerous statements are said. His foreman nodded. And at the Turner Ranch, 4 miles east of town, Elena Varga organized the second ledger by lamplight, not yet knowing that the man who turned her away at the train station was already thinking about how to make sure she didn't stay. 3 weeks after Elena arrived, one of the ranch horses developed a leg problem that the usual remedies weren't touching. The animal was valuable, one of Caleb's better working horses, and he'd already sent for the veterinarian twice. The veterinarian had applied a poultice and left instructions, but the horse wasn't improving. Elena asked Caleb if she could try something. He hesitated. Not because he doubted her, she thought, but because he was careful. Careful the way people are when something matters to them. "What do you have in mind?" he asked. She described a compress her grandfather had used, a particular combination of herbs applied warm. She had used it herself in Hungary many times. Caleb looked at the horse, looked at Elena. "The vet's methods aren't working," he said, which was not exactly yes, but was not no. Tom Haverford was there, and he crossed his arms and said nothing, which was his particular form of skepticism. Elena spent the afternoon preparing the compress. Tom watched from a distance that slowly over the course of the afternoon became slightly less distant. By evening, the horse was putting weight on the leg. By morning, it was walking. Tom Haverford stood at the barn door and looked at the horse for a long time. Then he turned to Elena, who was watching from a few feet away. "Where'd you learn that?" he said. "My grandfather," she said. "He raised horses in Hungary for 40 years. Tom was quiet. 40 years, he repeated. He always said. Elena told him that a horse does not care what language you speak to it. It cares only whether you mean it well. Tom looked at her. Then he looked at the horse. "Well," he said after a long moment, "I suppose that's true enough." He went back to work. But when lunchtime came for the first time since her arrival, Tom Haverford came and sat at the kitchen table without being invited. And nobody said anything about it, because in small places sometimes that is how change begins. Not with a speech, not with a confrontation, with one man sitting down at a table where he hadn't sat before. The morning Tom Haverford sat down uninvited at the kitchen table was the same morning Elena found the first note. It had been slipped under the front door sometime before dawn. She found it when she went to bring in the milk that one of the hands left on the porch each morning. It was a single piece of paper folded once. No envelope, no signature. She unfolded it. 3 words written in large block letters. Go back home. She stood on the porch and read it twice. Then she folded it back along its crease, put it in the pocket of her apron, and went inside to start the coffee. She didn't tell Caleb. Not that morning. She told herself it was because she didn't want to make trouble over something so small. But the truth, if she was honest with herself, was that she was afraid of what it meant if she said it out loud. Saying it out loud would make it real, and she wasn't ready for it to be real yet. So she made the coffee. She set out the biscuits she'd made the night before. She sat across from Tom when he came in and answered his questions about the supply ledger and let the morning settle around her like it was ordinary. But the note sat in her pocket all day like a coal that hadn't quite cooled. That afternoon she was working in the small office when she heard Caleb come in from the south pasture. She heard him stop in the hall. She heard him say her name, not loudly, not urgently, just her name. The way you say someone's name when you need to tell them something and you're deciding still how to say it. She came to the door. I was holding a note. Different paper, different handwriting. But the same message. This one had been nailed to the fence post at the edge of the property line. He looked at her. "Did you know about this?" he asked. She pulled the first one from her pocket and held it out. He took it, read it. His jaw tightened in the way that meant something was happening underneath his face that he wasn't letting out yet. "This was under the front door," she said. "When? This morning. And you didn't say anything?" "No." He was quiet for a moment. Not angry. Something more complicated than angry. The particular expression of a man who is angry on someone else's behalf and is trying to be careful with it. "Elena," he said, "if something like this happens, I need to know." "I know," she said. "I mean it." "I know you mean it," she said. "That's why I'm telling you now." He looked at the two notes. He set them on the desk beside her ledgers. "I'll ride into town tomorrow," he said. She started to say something to tell him it wasn't necessary, that it was just paper, that it would pass. But she stopped herself because she knew those things weren't true, and she had promised herself a long time ago that she would not pretend things were fine when they weren't, simply to make other people more comfortable. "All right," she said instead. He nodded. And then he did something she didn't expect. He reached out and briefly, quietly put his hand on the doorframe near her shoulder, not touching her. Just close, the way you stand near something when you want it to know you're there. Then he went back outside. Elena turned to her ledgers, but she did not pick up her pen for a long time. That evening, one of the younger ranch hands, a 19-year-old named Denny, with red hair and a gap between his front teeth, came and found her at the water pump while she was filling a bucket. He was nervous. She could see it in the way he kept shifting his weight, turning his hat in his hands. "Miss Varga," he said, "I just want you to know the notes weren't from any of us, the men here. I want you to know that." She looked at him. "Thank you, Denny, because some of us talked about it and we wanted you to know." "I appreciate it." He nodded, relieved, and started to go. Then he stopped. "Nathaniel Brooks has a long reach in this valley," he said quietly, not quite looking at her. He doesn't like things. He didn't arrange himself, if you understand what I mean." "I understand what you mean," she said. Denny nodded again and walked away fast, like someone who had said something they needed to say before they lost their nerve. Elena looked at the bucket of water she was holding. Nathaniel Brooks. She had known it, of course. She had known it from the moment she saw the first note, probably. But having it said out loud was different. It made things sharper, more particular. It turned a vague threat into a specific one. And specific threats, in Elena's experience, were both more frightening and more manageable than vague ones. You could not prepare for fog, but you could prepare for weather. She carried the bucket inside. She spent that night, after the rest of the household was asleep, going through the supply ledgers again, not looking for anything in particular, just reading the way she always read when she needed to think methodically, column by column, letting the numbers quiet the noise in her head. And then, somewhere around midnight, she found it. She almost missed it. It was buried in a column of routine purchases, feed, lumber, salt, tools, and on first reading it looked like nothing more than a clerical note. But Elena had been organizing records long enough to know that clerical notes that don't quite fit the pattern around them are almost never actually clerical notes. The entry read, "Grazing Payment Holloway Account, arranged per NB. She sat very still. She went to the next ledger, found two more entries, both in different handwriting, both referencing the same arrangement. She pulled out the receipts box, the one she had already sorted, and went through it again, more slowly this time. What she found by the time the lamp had burned down to its last quarter inch was this: for at least 2 years, Nathaniel Brooks had been arranging what he called grazing payments, money collected from smaller ranchers in the valley who used shared land for their cattle. The amounts were not enormous. But the receipts showed that the money collected was significantly more than what was being recorded as received. The difference went nowhere. Or rather, it went somewhere, but that somewhere had no name on any official document Elena could find. She sat back in her chair. She was not a lawyer. She was not a sheriff. She was a woman with a Hungarian accent who had been in this valley for less than a month. She understood with great clarity that what she held in her hands was either something very significant or something she was misreading entirely. She needed to be certain before she said a word. So she said nothing. Not that night. She closed the ledgers, put the notes in the back of the receipts box, turned down the lamp, went to her room. And in the dark, she thought about Denny's voice when he said, "Nathaniel Brooks has a long reach in this valley." She thought about the block letters on that folded note. She thought about the man on the train platform who had looked at her like a defective purchase and handed her 3 coins. Then she thought about her grandfather, who had raised horses for 40 years and believed that courage was not the absence of fear. She would be certain first. Then she would decide what to do. The next morning, Caleb rode into town. He came back 2 hours later with a quieter face than he'd left with. Elena was at the kitchen table when he came in. She watched him hang his hat on the hook by the door, pour himself a glass of water, and drink half of it before he turned around. "I spoke to the sheriff," he said. "And he listened. He said he'd look into it." A pause. "He and Nathaniel Brooks play cards together on the first Friday of every month." Elena said nothing. "I also spoke to Harrison Farley at the general store." Caleb continued. "Farley told me politely that he hoped I understood the notes were probably just some boys being foolish, and that the valley tends to go smoother when everyone stays in their proper lane." "Their proper lane," Elena repeated. His words. She thought about this. Then she said, "Do you believe the notes were just boys being foolish?" "No," Caleb said. "Do you believe the valley goes smoother when everyone stays in their proper lane?" Something flickered in his eyes. "I used to," he said. "I never questioned it much before." "What changed?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "I saw a woman walk into the path of a runaway wagon to save a child she'd never met. And then I watched that same woman get handed 3 coins and told her voice was the problem." He set down his glass. "That's a smooth valley for some people, not for everyone." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Then Elena said, "I need to talk to you about something I found in the ledgers." She told him. All of it. The entries, the receipts, the discrepancy, the initials. She set everything out on the table in front of him and walked him through it slowly, the way she would walk a student through a mathematics problem. "Here is what I see. Here is what I think it means. Here is what I am not certain of." Caleb listened without interrupting once. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she began to wonder if she'd made an error somewhere, misread something, drawn a conclusion that wasn't there. Then he said, "There are 6 ranchers in this valley who I know have been paying those grazing fees." "Do you know any of them well?" she asked. "3 of them, yes." "Would they talk to you?" "Maybe." He thought about it. "Maybe not. Nathaniel is the largest landowner in the valley after the Patterson family, and the Pattersons are out in Oregon for the season. He controls access to the northern water rights." A beat. "People who depend on those rights tend to be careful about who they talk to." "I understand that," Elena said. "But someone has to have a record, a receipt, something that shows what they paid versus what was reported." "You think they'd give it to you?" "I think," she said carefully, "that if you asked and told them what we suspect, and told them that you are willing to stand behind it, some of them might." Caleb looked at her for a moment. "You've thought about this," he said. "I thought about it most of last night." He pushed back from the table, stood, walked to the window and stood there for a moment with his back to her. Then he turned around. "I'll ride out to the Walsh place tomorrow morning," he said. "Jacob Walsh is a straight-talking man. If he's been shorted, he'll say so." Elena nodded. "And Elena." He waited until she looked up. "You keep those ledger pages somewhere safe, not in the office." She already had. She had moved them to the Bible that morning, the same worn Bible her mother's handwriting lived in, because it was the last place anyone would think to look, and because it seemed right somehow that her grandfather's courage and her mother's faith and this particular piece of evidence should share the same small weight. She didn't tell Caleb that part. Some things you keep to yourself. I'll keep them safe, she said. Jacob Walsh was not home when Caleb rode out the next morning. His wife was. Martha Walsh was a spare, sun-toughened woman of about 50, who met Caleb at the door with an expression that made clear she knew why he'd come before he opened his mouth. "Jacob's in town," she said. "I can come back." "He's been in town a lot lately," she said in a way that meant something specific. "Since he started talking to Nathaniel Brooks about renewing the water agreement." Caleb was still for a moment. "Martha," he said quietly, "has Jacob said anything to you about the grazing fees, about what he's been paying?" Martha Walsh looked at him for a long time. Her hands were folded in front of her. Her face was very still. "Mr. Turner," she said, "we have 3 children and 60 head of cattle and no access to water if Nathaniel decides we don't." "I understand that." "I don't think you fully understand it," she said. "Not unkindly, just accurately. Because your ranch has its own water." He had no answer for that. "What I can tell you," Martha Walsh said very quietly, "is that what Jacob paid and what Nathaniel recorded are not the same number, and that Jacob knows it, and that Jacob has decided that the difference is the price of peace." She looked at him directly. "That's all I can tell you." Caleb rode home slowly. When he got back, he told Elena everything Martha Walsh had said. Elena listened without expression. Then she said, "She's not wrong about the price of peace." "No," Caleb agreed. "But peace that's bought by letting someone steal from you is not peace," she said. "It's just a longer form of theft." He looked at her. "That's going to be a very hard argument to make to people who are afraid," he said. "I know," Elena said. "But it's still true." They sat with that for a moment. Then Caleb said something she hadn't expected. "There's a valley meeting in 3 weeks," he said. "Nathaniel hosts it every summer. All the ranchers come. It's been a tradition for 15 years, a chance to discuss shared grazing land water rights upcoming issues." He paused. "Nathaniel uses it to make announcements, to set the tone for the coming year." "You go every year?" Elena asked. "Every year." She thought about it. "This year," she said, "I would like to come with you." Caleb looked at her steadily. "You understand what that will mean." "I understand what it will mean," she said. "Nathaniel will be there. Everyone who's received those notes will assume they came from him. Every person in that room who has been paying more than their share will know what you know." "Yes," Elena said. "And it won't be safe," he said flatly. "Not in the way that matters in a place like this. Not for you." She thought about her grandfather. She thought about her mother. She thought about a boy on a train platform pointing and asking why the lady looked so lost, and a woman in a dress shop telling her this was an American establishment, and 3 coins dropped between 2 fingers, like something offered to an animal. She thought about the note with 3 words in block letters, and Denny's voice saying, "He has a long reach in this valley." "I didn't come this far," she said quietly, "to keep myself safe by staying silent." Something in Caleb's face shifted. It wasn't surprise she'd noticed he didn't surprise easily. It was more like recognition. The expression of someone watching a thing be said out loud that they had already believed without saying it. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks, she agreed. But 3 weeks was a long time. And things in Red Hollow moved faster than 3 weeks when someone wanted them to. 4 days later, Caleb came in from town with a face that had gone careful and still in the way it went when he was controlling something underneath. Elena was teaching Denny to read at the kitchen table, something that had happened almost by accident a week earlier, when she'd found him staring at a supply list with the expression of a man navigating by instinct. She'd offered, he'd resisted, and then he'd said yes so quickly that she understood the resistance was mostly habit. She looked at Caleb's face and told Denny they'd pick it up after supper. Denny left. Caleb sat down. "Harrison Farley at the general store told me today," he said, "that he won't be extending our supply credit." Elena was still. "We've had credit with Farley for 6 years," Caleb said. He's never raised a problem. Today he said he's reviewing arrangements with all his accounts. But he said it while looking at the floor, which means it's not all his accounts. It's this one, Elena said. It's this one. Because of me, she said. Caleb looked at her. Because of someone who doesn't want you comfortable here, he said. That's different from it being because of you. She appreciated the distinction. She held on to it. What does this mean for the ranch? She asked. In the short term, manageable, he said. I have enough supply to get through the next few weeks. I'll need to make other arrangements after that. It's possible just more work. He folded his hands on the table. But Farley's not the only business in town that Nathaniel has relationships with. If this continues, it spreads. He's trying to make you regret hiring me, she said. He's trying to make me choose, Caleb said. The kitchen was quiet. And, Elena said, I already chose, he said so simply and so directly that it landed like a stone dropped in still water. No drama in it. No performance. Just the plain statement of a man who had made a decision and was done deliberating. Elena looked at him for a moment. There was something happening between them that had been building quietly and without announcement since the first morning she'd made coffee before he came downstairs. It wasn't the kind of thing that declared itself loudly. It was quieter than that. It was in the way he answered her questions about the ranch, as if her understanding of it mattered. In the way he'd asked one evening about Hungary, not politely, not curiously, but genuinely, with the particular attention of someone who actually wants to know. In the way he'd put his hand near the doorframe that first evening, not touching just present. She didn't speak about it. It wasn't the moment, and even if it had been, she wasn't a woman who rushed toward things just because she could feel them coming. Instead, she said, then we need to move faster. Faster how? The receipts I found reference 3 specific transactions in the last 2 years where the shortfall is large enough to be provable. Not a matter of interpretation provable with paper. She leaned forward. But we need one of those ranchers to come forward. Someone who kept their own record. Martha Walsh won't. Not Walsh, she said. There's another name that appears twice in the receipts. Someone smaller. A man named Peter Hoven, Dutch name. He runs a small cattle operation on the eastern edge of the valley. Caleb frowned. I know of him. I don't know him. He's an immigrant, Elena said simply. Caleb looked at her. Nathaniel would have underestimated him, she said. Men like Nathaniel always underestimate people whose accent he doesn't like. He would have assumed Hoven didn't understand what he was paying or didn't have the language to challenge it. She paused. But men like Peter Hoven often understand exactly what's happening to them. They simply need someone to stand beside them before they'll say it. The quiet in the kitchen was a different kind now. Sharper. Particular. You're talking about yourself, Caleb said. I'm talking about everyone who ever kept their mouth closed because they didn't believe anyone would believe them, she said. Yes, including myself. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I'll ride out to the Hoven place tomorrow. She shook her head. I'll come with you. Elena. Caleb, she said, and there was something in the way she said his name quietly without urgency, with the particular steadiness of someone who has already decided that stop the argument before it started. He'll talk to me. She didn't say it arrogantly. She said it the way you state a thing you know to be true, not because you're certain of everything, but because you understand this one particular thing with precision. Caleb looked at her. All right, he said. The ride to the Hoven place. The next morning was cold, an early northern cold that had come down from the mountains faster than expected, the kind that makes your breath visible and makes the horses impatient. Elena wore the heaviest coat she owned, which was not particularly heavy, and she kept her hands tucked in her sleeves when she didn't need them. Caleb noticed after about a mile and reached behind the wagon seat and produced a blanket without saying anything and handed it to her. She took it without saying anything either. That was how things were between them, she had noticed. Very few words, but the right ones in the right moments, and a great deal communicated in the space that most people fill with noise. Peter Hoven was in his yard when they arrived. He was a stocky man in his 60s with a white beard and the kind of eyes that have spent a great deal of time watching the horizon. He saw them coming while they were still a quarter-mile away, and he didn't move toward them or away from them. He simply watched. When they pulled up, he looked at Caleb. Then he looked at Elena. Then he said something in Dutch. She didn't speak Dutch, but she answered him in Hungarian. He blinked. Then slowly, cautiously, something that almost became a smile crossed his face. "You are not from here," he said in careful English. "Neither are you," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Come inside." I had records. She had been right about that. He had kept every receipt himself in a small wooden box under his bed, because he had not trusted the arrangement from the beginning. And he was, as he told her quietly over a cup of strong coffee at his kitchen table, a man who believed in keeping paper. "My father told me," he said, "that in this country, your word is worth what you can prove." Elena said, "My grandfather told me something very similar." They looked at each other with the particular understanding of people who have carried the same lesson across different oceans. His records showed a discrepancy. Not enormous, but clear. The amounts he had paid were 15 to 20% higher than what appeared in Nathaniel's reported figures. Over 2 years it added up. He spread the receipts on the table and looked at them, then at Elena, then at Caleb. "If I show these to someone," he said carefully, "and nothing comes of it." "Something will come of it," Elena said. "You cannot promise that," he said. "No," she said. "I cannot promise the outcome. I can tell you that I will stand beside you in that room, and that Mr. Turner will stand beside both of us." She paused. "We are not asking you to stand alone, Mr. Hoeven. That is what I can promise." The old man looked at his records for a long time. Then he looked at Elena. "In Holland," he said slowly, "when I was young, there was a woman in my village who would not stop telling the truth about a man in power who was stealing from his neighbors." He folded his hands. Everyone told her to stop, that nothing would change, that she was making things worse for herself. "What happened?" Elena asked. "She didn't stop," he said. "A beat." "What happened to the man?" she asked. Peter Hoeven almost smiled again. "He stopped stealing," he said. He reached out and began gathering his receipts into a careful stack. "The meeting is in 3 weeks," he said. 3 weeks, Caleb confirmed. The old Dutchman nodded, put his receipts back in their box, closed the lid. "Then I will be there," he said. On the ride back to the ranch, Caleb and Elena were quiet for the first mile. The cold had settled, and the horses moved at a steady pace, and the land around them was vast and indifferent in the way land always is, which Elena had always found strangely more comforting than troubling. Then Caleb said, "You knew he'd have records." "I hoped," she said. "You were certain." She considered this. "I was certain he would understand what I was saying, even if I couldn't know what he had." People who have been underestimated for a long time become very careful about what they know and how they keep it. She paused. "It's a kind of armor." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is that what the Bible is?" She looked at him. "You moved those ledger pages into your Bible," he said. "I noticed when I went to check that you'd moved them somewhere safe." She was quiet for a moment, deciding. "The Bible was my mother's," she said. "Her handwriting is in the margins. She gave it to me the morning I left Budapest. She said carry it because the words inside it are true, and truth is the heaviest thing you can carry, and also the lightest." Caleb thought about that. "Both," he said. "Both," she confirmed. They were quiet again. The ranch came into sight ahead. The dogs materialized at the edge of the fence to meet them the way they always did, running alongside the wagon with entirely unnecessary urgency. Elena watched them and felt something shift in her chest, something small and warm like a coal catching. She had been in this valley for less than a month. She had been handed 3 coins and told her voice was the wrong shape. She had found evidence of something corrupt, buried in columns of numbers. She had sat in a Dutch immigrant's kitchen and shared a cup of strong coffee and made a promise she intended to keep. She was still an outsider in Red Hollow. She knew that. She would be an outsider in Red Hollow for a long time, possibly forever, because that was simply the mathematics of belonging. It accrued slowly, and sometimes the numbers never quite added up. But the ranch, she thought, as the wagon rolled through the gate and the dogs circled beneath them, the ranch was beginning to feel like something else. Not home. Not yet. She was too careful for that word, but the beginning of a possibility, and sometimes that is enough to hold on to. That evening, as Elena was setting the table for supper and Tom Haverford was bringing in more wood without being asked, something he had started doing without acknowledgement or explanation. In the past 2 weeks, there was a sound from outside. A horse, moving fast. Caleb was up before anyone else. He came back from this door with a face that had gone careful and still again, and in his hand he had a letter still sealed that had been brought by a rider who had apparently not wanted to wait. He set it on the table. Elena looked at it. The seal was wax. The handwriting on the outside was bold, confident, the writing of a man who had never once had reason to doubt his own importance. Mr. Turner, it read. I think it is time we had a conversation. It was signed N. Brooks. Everyone at the table was very quiet. Tom Haverford set down the piece of wood he was holding. Denny, who had been waiting for supper, had gone very still. Caleb picked up the letter and turned it in his hand once deliberately and then set it back down. He looked at Elena. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything. But something passed between them in that silence, something that had been building since a cold afternoon on a train platform, and a horse stopping in the middle of a street, and a man saying, "You didn't scare those horses," in a voice that meant something larger than the horses. Caleb picked up the letter, folded it once, slid it into his shirt pocket. Supper, he said. Then we talk. Supper that night was the quietest meal the Turner Ranch had seen since Elena arrived. Tom ate without speaking. Denny kept his eyes on his plate. The two other hands who sometimes joined the table, a broad-shouldered man named Cole and a quiet older fellow. Everyone called Swede, both seemed to understand without being told that the folded letter in Caleb's shirt pocket had changed the temperature of the room. Elena ate steadily. She had learned a long time ago that the body needed fuel, especially when the mind was working hard, and her mind was working very hard indeed. When the plates were cleared, Caleb pulled out the letter. He read it aloud. It was brief. Nathaniel Brooks wrote the way he spoke with the practiced ease of a man who had never had to fight for authority and therefore did not recognize when he was overreaching it. He wrote that he had heard certain rumors, that he believed a conversation between gentlemen could resolve any misunderstanding, that he would expect Caleb at the Brooks Ranch the following morning at 9 o'clock. He did not mention Elena by name. He didn't have to. Tom Haverford, who had been listening with his arms crossed, said, "He calls it a misunderstanding." "He does," Caleb said. "That's what powerful men call things they want to make go away," Tom said. He glanced at Elena. "No offense." "None taken," Elena said. "You're right." Denny said more carefully, "Are you going to go?" Caleb set the letter on the table. "Yes." Denny looked alarmed. "Alone?" "I'm not sure yet." Caleb looked at Elena. She had already thought about it. She'd been thinking about it since the rider arrived. "You should go." "Go," she said. "Alone, at 9 o'clock as he asked." Everyone looked at her. "If you refuse or delay, he'll take it as a sign that you're preparing something. He'll move first." She folded her hands on the table. "But if you go willingly, calmly, he'll talk. Men like Nathaniel Brooks cannot resist talking when they believe they have the advantage. And while he talks, you listen. You learn what he knows and what he only suspects." Tom Haverford was very quiet. Then he said, "That's not bad thinking." Coming from Tom, it was practically a standing ovation. Caleb nodded slowly. "And you?" "I'll be here," she said. "Working, visibly. So that if anyone comes to the ranch while you're gone, there's nothing to find but a woman doing her accounts." She said it simply, but the implication sat in the room for a moment. The implication that someone might come to the ranch while Caleb was occupied elsewhere. That it might not be an accident. Cole, who rarely spoke at the table, said, "I'll stay back tomorrow. Got fences to check near the house anyway." Swede nodded once, which from him meant agreement and solidarity both. Elena looked around the table. At Tom with his crossed arms and his slow-warming honesty. At Denny with his gap-toothed nervousness and his genuine decency. At Cole and Swede with their quiet, practical loyalty. She thought about how she had arrived here with nothing but a suitcase and a Bible and 3 coins. She thought this is what belonging feels like when it starts. Not a grand welcome. Not a ceremony. Just people deciding one small choice at a time to stand in the same direction. "Thank you," she said. To all of them, and to none of them in particular. Tom uncrossed his arms and stood up and said gruffly that he was going to check on the horses, which was his way of ending a moment before it got too large for him to manage. Everyone else took that as the signal to clear out. Caleb stayed at the table after the others left. Elena stayed too. "What do you think he'll say?" she asked. Caleb thought about it honestly. "He'll tell me that my arrangement with you is causing problems in the valley, that people are uncomfortable, that the notes were probably just overexcited boys like Farley said. He'll offer to let things go quietly if I let you go quietly. And if you don't? He'll tell me very politely what it will cost me not to." Elena absorbed this. "Do you know what it will cost you?" she asked. He looked at her directly. "I know what it will cost me if I do." The kitchen was very still. Elena had spent the past weeks being careful, being measured, controlling what she said and when she said it and how. She had learned that in Red Hollow. Like everywhere else, she had lived as a foreigner. The margin for error was narrower for her than for others, and she could not afford the luxury of speaking carelessly. But there were some moments when carefulness was its own kind of dishonesty. "Caleb," she said, "you have a good life here, a good ranch. You built it yourself and you've kept it and it matters to you. I don't want to be the reason you lose pieces of it." He was quiet. "I mean that," she said. "I came here to work. I came here to build something. I did not come here to make your life smaller." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "When I was 22 years old, I was on a cattle drive in Texas. We had a older man, been doing it for 30 years, knew everything there was to know about moving cattle across open country. The trail boss fired him outside of San Antonio because he was too slow to suit the schedule." He paused. "He wasn't too slow. He was methodical. He was the best reader of weather and terrain on that drive. But he was inconvenient, and inconvenient things get moved out of the way." Elena waited. "I didn't say anything," Caleb said. "I was 22. I told myself it wasn't my place." He looked down at the table. "I thought about that man for years afterward, whether he found other work, whether his family was all right." He looked back up. "I made myself a promise somewhere around year 3 of thinking about it, that I would not be the man who stayed quiet because it was convenient." He said it the way he said everything, without performance, without asking her to applaud him for it. She looked at him. This man, she thought, who had said more words in that one small speech than she had heard him say in the 2 weeks combined. This quiet, particular, careful man who watched things and understood them and then held them inside himself for years until they turned into something he could stand behind. She did not say what she was thinking. Not yet. Instead, she said, "Then we go to the meeting, all 3 of us. 3, you, me, Peter Hoven." She paused. "And the receipts." Caleb was quiet. 2 weeks, he said. 2 weeks, she agreed. He rode out the next morning at 8:30. Elena watched him go from the porch, then turned and went inside and sat down at the accounts desk. She could not work. She tried for half an hour and gave up because her mind kept moving ahead of the numbers. She got up, made a second pot of coffee, sat back down. Cole passed the window twice, checking fences that did not need to be checked. She appreciated it enormously and said nothing about it. At 11:15, she heard the horse. She was at the window before she knew she'd moved. It was Caleb. He tied up the horse and came in the front door and stood in the hallway for a moment, hat in his hand, and his face had that careful stillness that she was learning to read the way you read. Whether not just what it showed, but what it was holding back. "How was it?" she asked from the kitchen doorway. He came in and sat down at the table. "He knows about the receipts," Caleb said. The air went out of the room. Elena sat down slowly. How? He didn't say, but he knew. Not all of it. I don't think he knows about Hoven specifically, but he knows I've been looking at the supply ledgers. He knows there are discrepancies I've found. He set his hat on the table. He called them accounting errors. Accounting errors, Elena repeated. Historical ones, regrettable. Things that happen when records aren't kept with proper attention. His voice was completely flat. He said he'd be happy to review any concerns I had privately between the two of us so that we could correct the record in a way that caused no disruption. In other words, Elena said, he wants the evidence destroyed quietly before the meeting. In exactly those words, Caleb said, without using any of those words. She pressed her fingers against the table surface thinking. Did he threaten you directly? She asked. No, she asked. No, he doesn't do that directly. What he did was mention 3 times in the course of 20 minutes. How unfortunate it would be if the Turner Ranch lost access to the northern grazing permits next season. He paused. Those permits are worth roughly 1/3 of my annual cattle revenue. 1/3. Elena felt the weight of that number. He also mentioned, Caleb said more quietly, that Red Hollow is a town where people look after each other, where community harmony matters, where people who cause disruption sometimes find that the community becomes less welcoming. He was talking about me, she said. He was talking about both of us, Caleb said. But yes, mostly you. She sat with it, the practical part of her brain, the part that had managed households and kept ledgers and crossed an ocean on a budget that barely held, was already calculating. The loss of 1/3 of the ranch's revenue was not something Caleb could simply absorb. The ranch was not large. It ran on careful margins. She knew that from 6 weeks of watching his accounts. If Nathaniel pulled the grazing permits, the ranch would survive probably. But it would be a different kind of surviving. The kind with no cushion, no room for a bad season, no capacity to weather a hard winter. She had done that kind of surviving before. She knew what it cost. Caleb, she said. No, he said. She blinked. Whatever you're about to say next, he said. The answer is no. I am not sending you away. I am not asking you to leave. And I am not going to sit down with Nathaniel Brooks and let him believe that all it takes is a financial threat to make me behave. He said it with the same quietness. He said everything. But underneath the quietness was something else, something that had been there since the beginning. She realized, since the moment he'd stepped forward on the main street of Red Hollow and said, "You didn't scare those horses. Not loudness, not performance, just absolute bedrock certainty." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "There's something else, isn't there?" It wasn't a question. He reached into his coat and put a folded piece of paper on the table. Different from the others. This wasn't a note slipped under a door. It was a document legal-looking formal, with a heading she recognized immediately. A notice of complaint, filed with the Territorial Land Office dated 2 days ago. She picked it up and read it. The complaint alleged that the Turner Ranch had been allowing illegal squatters on its property, that a foreign national of unknown standing was occupying ranch premises without proper documentation of legal residency, that the presence of this individual constituted a potential violation of territorial settlement codes. Elena read it twice. The language was careful, precise. The kind of language written by someone who understood exactly how much a formal document frightened people who had reason to be uncertain about their standing. She set it down. "He filed this before you arrived this morning," she said. "Filed it yesterday," Caleb said. The writer who brought his letter also brought a copy to the land office. "He planned both at the same time," she said. "The invitation to talk and the formal complaint. One was the conversation, the other was the pressure." "The conversation was the performance," Caleb said. "The complaint is the actual move." Elena was quiet for a moment. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her, and she was watching them the way she sometimes did when she was thinking hard, as if the steadiness of her own hands could anchor the rest of her. She thought about her documents. She had them. She was careful. She had always been careful, She had learned early that paper was the only thing that stood between a person and the particular kind of vulnerability that came from being foreign in a place that wasn't sure it wanted you. She had her travel papers. She had the letter of arrangement from Caleb. She had kept everything. But a formal complaint was a different creature. Even a false one. Even one that would eventually be dismissed. A formal complaint took time to resolve, and time was something Nathaniel was counting on. Time until the Valley meeting. Time to create enough instability that Elena and Caleb arrived at that meeting already weakened, already defensive. "He's trying to put us on our heels," she said. "Yes. Before we can put anything in front of the other ranchers." "Yes." She unfolded her hands, placed them flat on the table. "Then we need to move the meeting," she said. Caleb looked at her. "We can't move his meeting. He hosts it." "Not his meeting," she said. "Ours." The silence that followed was the thinking kind. "We go to the ranchers first," she said. "Before Nathaniel's meeting. We don't wait for him to set the room. We don't walk in as people responding to accusations. We walk in as people presenting evidence." She leaned forward. "Who in this valley besides Jacob Walsh and Peter Hoven do you trust?" He thought about it. "Franklin Carr. He runs the Carr spread about 6 miles north. He and Nathaniel have had their differences over water rights before. He's kept quiet about it, but he's never been comfortable." "Would he meet with you?" "I think so." "And the Delacroix brothers, their name appears in the receipts twice." Caleb looked at her sharply. "You know about them." "I've been through every line of every ledger we have," she said. "The Delacroix brothers paid grazing fees 18 months ago that were never recorded. A significant amount. I noticed it in the second week." "You didn't say anything." "I was still building the case," she said. "I needed to understand the full pattern before I spoke." He looked at her with an expression she was starting to recognize, the particular look of a man recalibrating something he thought he already understood. "How many names do you have?" he asked. She went to the Bible on the windowsill. She opened it to the back where she had kept her own notes written small and neat in the margins around her mother's handwriting, because there was nowhere safer in the house. She brought it to the table and opened it to the last pages. 7 names. 7 ranchers whose payments cross-referenced against the recorded figures showed discrepancies. Caleb read the list. He was quiet for a long time. Then he looked up. "Elena, this isn't a complaint about accounting errors." His voice had gone very quiet. "This is evidence of systematic fraud across the entire valley. For 2 years. Possibly more." "Yes," she said. "Why didn't you tell me all of this before?" "Because," she said carefully, "I needed to know that you were the kind of man who would stand behind it when you understood the size of it." She met his eyes. "And I needed to know that for reasons beyond the ranch and beyond the grazing permits. I needed to know it for reasons I am not yet ready to say out loud." He held her gaze. And in the space of that look, without either of them saying another word, they both understood exactly what those reasons were. Caleb cleared his throat, looked back at the list. "We need a week," he said. 7 ranchers, 1 week. "We have 12 days until his meeting," she said. "That's enough." He stood, picked up his hat. "I'll ride out to Carr today," he said. "Can you write a letter to Hoven so he knows what we're planning?" She was already reaching for paper. He stopped in the doorway. "Elena." She looked up. "The complaint at the land office. I've already spoken to an attorney in Billings by telegraph this morning. He says the filing is weak. Bureaucratic harassment is how he put it." He paused. "Your documents are in order. You have nothing to fear from it." She nodded, said nothing. He left. She sat for a moment with the letter paper in front of her, and the Bible open beside her, and her mother's handwriting in the margins, and her own small, careful notes between them, and she thought about the word fear. She was afraid. She would not pretend she wasn't. She was afraid in the particular way of someone who has survived enough to know exactly what loss feels like. Not abstractly, not theoretically, but in the body, in the specific weight of a suitcase, and 3 coins, and a closed door. She knew what it was to have the ground pulled out, and she knew it could happen again. But she had stopped somewhere in the past weeks, letting the fear make decisions. Her grandfather had raised horses for 40 years. He had told her that a frightened animal is not a coward. It is simply a creature that has encountered danger. The question is never whether the fear comes. The question is what you do while you're feeling it. She put the pen to the paper. "Dear Mr. Hoeven," she wrote, "we are moving faster than planned. I hope you are keeping your receipts somewhere safe." Over the next 9 days, Caleb wrote out to every name on the list. Franklin Carr met him at the fence line and listened with his hat in his hands and said quietly that he had wondered for 2 years if he was the only one being shorted, and that it was a relief beyond expression to discover he was not crazy. The Delacroix brothers, Jean and Marcel Louisiana-born, who had come north after the war and built a solid operation that Nathaniel had always treated with the faint condescension of a man who found their origins vaguely inconvenient. Listened to Caleb's entire account without interrupting. Then Jean Delacroix said, "We have every receipt, every single one. We kept them because Marcel said we might need them someday." He looked at his brother. Marcel was right. Marcel said nothing, but he went and got a tin box from the back of the house, and the tin box was full. Not every rancher agreed to come forward. 2 of the 7 said no, quietly apologetically, with explanations that all amounted to the same thing: they could not afford the risk. Elena heard this without judgment. She understood the mathematics of risk better than most. But 5 of the 7 said yes. 5 ranchers with receipts, with records, with 2 years of evidence they'd been carrying quietly like stones in their pockets. 3 days before the Valley meeting, Elena drafted the document she had been building toward since the first night she found the discrepancies. She worked on it for 12 hours straight, stopping only when Tom Haverford came in at 9 in the evening and set a plate of food beside her elbow without a word, which was the most overtly tender thing she had ever seen him do. She finished it just before midnight. It was 8 pages long. It named every transaction. It compared the paid amounts against the recorded amounts. It noted the pattern across 2 years and across 7 separate ranching operations. It was the kind of document that left no room for the word misunderstanding. She brought it to Caleb the next morning. He read all 8 pages. When he finished, he set it down and was quiet for a long moment. "This is going to make him dangerous," he said. "He already is dangerous," she said. "The difference is that now we know exactly how dangerous, and he doesn't know how much we know." Caleb looked at her. "You're not frightened," he said. "I'm very frightened," she said immediately. "I would be a fool not to be." "You don't look it." "I know," she said. "I learned a long time ago that what you look like and what you feel are 2 different things, and that there are situations where you cannot afford to let them be the same." I thought about that. Then he said, "What do you need from me tomorrow?" "Stand beside me," she said. "That's all. Stand beside me, and don't let anyone make you move." He nodded. The night before the Valley meeting, Elena could not sleep. She lay on her cot and listened to the ranch settle into dark quiet, and she thought about every door that had closed, and every voice that had said, "Go back home," and the 3 coins, and the folded note, and the woman in the dress shop, and Denny shifting his hat in his hands when he said he wanted her to know it wasn't them. She thought about Tom Haverford, who had set a plate beside her elbow at 9 in the evening. She thought about Peter Hoeven with his tin box of receipts and his Dutch father's advice about paper. She thought about Caleb Turner saying, "I already chose," with the simplicity of someone who had decided before he was asked. She got up before dawn, dressed carefully, braided her hair the way her mother had taught her, tight and smooth, the way you prepare for something that matters. She took the 8-page document from the desk, took the receipts that Peter Hoeven had sent over 2 days earlier, took her own ledger notes. She placed her mother's Bible on top of everything the way you place a hand on something you want to remember is with you. Then she heard Caleb come downstairs. He stopped in the doorway of the office, looked at her, at the careful way she'd prepared at the documents stacked in front of her at her face. He said, "Are you ready?" She picked up the stack of papers. "I have been ready," she said, "since the moment I stepped off that train." He nodded once, held out his hand, not romantically, not tenderly, but the way you hold out your hand to someone you are about to walk into something difficult with. "Steady." "Sure." She took it. They walked out together. And somewhere in Red Hollow, Nathaniel Brooks was getting dressed for his Valley meeting, confident that the morning would go exactly as he had planned. He had no idea what was coming through the door. The Brooks Ranch House was the largest private building in the Valley, and Nathaniel made sure everyone knew it by hosting the annual meeting in its main hall. A long room with a high ceiling that he had furnished with enough chairs to seat 30 people comfortably. He had done this every summer for 15 years. It was, as he frequently reminded people, a tradition of community. What he meant was that it was a room where he sat at the head and everyone else faced him. When Caleb's wagon pulled up outside, there were already 11 horses tied at the post. Peter Hoven's old gray mare was among them. Elena noticed it immediately and felt something loosen slightly in her chest. He had come. Caleb helped her down from the wagon without making a ceremony of it. She carried the documents against her side under her arm. Her face was composed. Her heart was doing something considerably less composed, but that was between her and her own ribs. Tom Haverford had insisted on coming. He had not asked permission. 3 days ago, he had simply said at breakfast, "I'll be at the meeting." And that was the end of the discussion. He climbed down from the back of the wagon now with the deliberate care of a man whose back reminded him daily of its limitations, and he straightened up and looked at the Brooks Ranch House with an expression of profound personal disapproval. Denny had stayed at the ranch. Someone had to. He had shaken Elena's hand before they left very formally and said, "You're going to do fine, Miss Varga." She had thanked him and meant it completely. They went inside. The room was already loud with the particular noise of men who know each other well enough to fill silence without saying anything important. Elena felt every conversation pause as they entered. Not stop pause. The way a room breathes differently when something unexpected walks through the door. She recognized some faces. Franklin Carr, tall and weathered, standing near the window, gave Caleb a small nod. Jean Delacroix, seated near the middle of the room, met Elena's eyes and held them for a moment with an expression that said clearly, we are here. His brother Marcel sat beside him, arms crossed, face unreadable. She also recognized the faces that looked away. The men who had said no. 2 of them seated toward the front who had decided the risk was too great. She held no anger toward them. She understood. But she noted it the way she noted everything, precisely, without illusion. Nathaniel Brooks was at the far end of the room speaking to his foreman. He saw Caleb the moment they came in. His eyes moved to Elena, and what passed across his face was not surprise. He had expected her to come. He had probably counted on it. Men like Nathaniel preferred to handle their problems where they could see them. What he had not expected, Elena thought, was the documents under her arm, or the particular expression on her face. He recovered quickly. He was practiced at recovery. "Turner," he said, moving toward them with his hand extended, his voice carrying the warmth of a man absolutely confident in his own hospitality. "Good of you to come." Caleb shook his hand. Elena did not offer hers. She simply looked at Nathaniel Brooks steadily until he was forced to acknowledge her directly. "Miss..." He paused, deliberately. "Varga, was it?" "It is," she said. He smiled the way men smile when they want you to know the smile is a choice. "I wasn't aware this meeting extended to household staff." "She's here as my partner in the ranch's business affairs," Caleb said. His voice was completely even. "Which is what this meeting is about." Nathaniel held his smile for exactly 1 beat too long. Then he turned and said the meeting would begin shortly and walked back to the front of the room. Elena let out a slow breath. Tom appeared at her elbow. "He's rattled," he said quietly. "He's performing," she said. "That's different." "Maybe," Tom said. "But I've known men like him for 40 years. That pause before your name, that was real." She considered that, took it in, filed it. The meeting began, the way it always began. Nathaniel at the front, the room arranged in rough rows before him. The established rhythm of a man accustomed to running this particular hour of this particular day exactly as he liked. He spoke about shared grazing schedules for the fall, about a dispute over a fence line on the eastern boundary, about the upcoming territorial survey that would affect water rights documentation. How was good at it. Elena gave him that. He had the voice of a man born to be believed, deep, steady, authoritative without being aggressive. If you didn't know what she knew, you would simply hear competence. She watched the room while he spoke. Watched the ranchers listening, some nodding, some with the careful, neutral faces of men who had long ago learned not to show too much in front of Nathaniel Brooks. She watched Franklin Carr, who kept his eyes on the floor. She watched Jean Delacroix, who watched Nathaniel with the particular attention of someone cataloging what they're hearing against what they know. She watched Peter Hoven, who sat in the third row and held his hat in his hands and looked like a man in church, very still, very attentive, privately preparing. Then Nathaniel said, "Before we move on to new business, I want to address something that's been circulating in the valley as rumor. I believe it's better to speak plainly than to let misunderstanding grow roots." The room shifted, a collective attention settling. "There have been questions," Nathaniel said, "raised about the grazing fee accounts. I want to be clear that the records have been reviewed by my office, and any discrepancies are the result of administrative error during a period when my bookkeeper was unwell. These errors have been corrected." He looked around the room with the expression of a man extending grace to a situation he had every right to be irritated by. "I understand how rumors start. I don't hold it against anyone." Elena felt the temperature in the room change. Several of the ranchers visibly relaxed. She could almost see the relief moving through them, the enormous human desire to believe the explanation that requires the least courage to accept. She stood up. The room went quiet so quickly it was almost physical. Nathaniel looked at her. His expression didn't change, but his foreman standing by the far wall moved slightly, a small shift of weight that Elena clocked and catalogued. "I apologize for interrupting," she said. She did not sound apologetic. She sounded the way she had trained herself to sound in rooms where she was the least expected voice, clear-measured, entirely certain of her right to be heard. "But I'd like to address the accounting errors directly, if Mr. Brooks will allow it." "I don't believe," Nathaniel began. "I have the records here," she said. She held up the document. 8 pages, corners squared, everything in order. "These are the original receipts cross-referenced against the reported figures for the grazing fees collected over the past 2 years. She kept her voice completely level. "The discrepancy is not administrative error. It is consistent. It is systematic. And it affects every rancher in this room." The silence was absolute. Then everyone started talking at once. Nathaniel raised his voice over the noise. "This woman has been in this valley for less than 2 months. She has access to exactly 1 ranch's records, and she is presenting herself as an authority on. She's not alone." It was Peter Hoven. He stood up slowly with the careful dignity of a man who has waited a long time to stand up in exactly this way. He held his own folder of receipts in both hands. "I have records," he said. His accent was as thick as Elena's, maybe thicker. 2 years of records. Everything I paid. Everything that was reported." He paused. "They are not the same numbers." Nathaniel's face had gone very still. Jean Delacroix stood. "We have records too." He looked at his brother. Marcel stood. "As do I." Franklin Carr from near the window, his voice rough and deliberate. "I've had them for 18 months. I wasn't sure what to do with them until now." The room was on its feet. Not all of it. The 2 ranchers who had said no were still seated, staring at the floor. But enough. Enough that the geometry of the room had changed completely, and Nathaniel could feel it. Elena could see him feeling it. He turned to look at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the smooth authority. Not the practiced condescension. Something rawer than that, and more dangerous. "You have no legal standing in this territory," he said. And this time, he did not pretend to be addressing the room. He was speaking directly to her, and his voice had dropped to something almost private. "You are a foreign national. Your residency documentation is under complaint. Anything you say here, anything you present here, will be challenged on that basis alone." The room went quiet again. This was the move. Elena had known it was coming, had known since the day Caleb brought home the land office complaint, and she had prepared for it. The way you prepare for weather, you cannot stop, not by trying to prevent it, but by making sure you were not standing in the lowest ground when it arrived. She did not flinch. "My documentation is in order," she said. "The complaint filed against me was reviewed by a territorial attorney and found to be without legal foundation. I have the response here." She reached into the back of the document stack and produced a single page, the attorney's letter, which had arrived by telegraph just 2 days earlier. She did not wave it dramatically. She simply held it up clearly so the room could see it existed. "The complaint has been dismissed." Nathaniel's foreman took a step forward. Caleb stepped forward too. Just one step. Not toward the foreman, not aggressive, not posturing. Just a single deliberate step that placed him between the foreman and Elena, and he looked at the foreman, the way men in this territory looked at each other when they wanted to communicate something with precision and without words. The foreman stopped. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Elena could see it from where she stood. "You think a few pieces of paper make you belong here," he said. And now the performance was completely gone, and what was underneath it was exactly what she had suspected. Not confidence, but fury. The specific fury of a man who has never been genuinely challenged in a room he controls. "You think your accent and your foreign ledgers and your—" "What I think?" Elena said, cutting through him with the same calm she had used on the horses that first day in the middle of the street. "Is that what belongs here is the truth." She walked forward. Not all the way to the front, she wasn't trying to take his position. She stopped in the middle of the room so that she was equidistant from every person in it, and she turned slowly so that she was speaking to everyone, not just to Nathaniel. "I came to this valley 6 weeks ago with a suitcase and 3 coins, she said. "I was told at the train station that my voice was the wrong shape for this place. I was turned away from every business on the main street. I was handed a note telling me to go home." She kept her voice completely steady. "I understand that I am not from here. I understand that I speak differently, and I come from somewhere different, and that for some people in this room, those facts are more important than anything else I might say or do." She paused. "But I have sat with your records for 6 weeks. I have counted your numbers, and what those numbers show is that this man—" She did not point dramatically. She simply turned her head toward Nathaniel. "Has been collecting 15 to 20% more from each of you than he has reported. For 2 years, from every single one of you." She set the 8-page document on the nearest empty chair. Then she set Peter Hoven's folder beside it. Then Franklin Carr's, which he walked forward and placed himself. Then the Delacroix brothers, one after the other. "I am not asking you to believe me because of who I am," Elena said. "I am asking you to look at the paper, your numbers, your receipts." The room was the stillest it had been. Then a man near the back, a rancher. Elena didn't know by name. A heavy-set man with a gray mustache who had said nothing since the meeting began reached into his coat. He produced a folded set of papers. Receipts. He held them up, and his face was the face of someone who has been holding something for too long and is profoundly relieved to put it down. "Mine aren't the same either," he said. How was the one who hadn't agreed to come forward? Who had said no? Who had told Caleb the risk was too great? Elena looked at him. He looked back at her and said roughly, "Doesn't mean I wasn't keeping track." Nathaniel moved. He moved fast for a man his size toward the door, Elena thought, or toward his foreman, or away from the room that had turned on him. But he stopped because Caleb was already at the door, not blocking it, not physically restraining anyone, simply standing there the way he stood everywhere present, unhurried, taking up exactly the space he occupied, and not an inch more. "Nathaniel," Caleb said, "the Territorial Land Office has a circuit inspector coming through Red Hollow next week. I've been in correspondence with his office." He said it quietly, conversationally. "The way you mention something everyone is about to find relevant. I thought they should know about the meeting today." Nathaniel stared at him. "You planned this," he said. "Elena planned it," Caleb said simply. "I helped." The room had reorganized itself entirely. People who had been seated were standing. People who had been near the front were moving toward the cluster of documents. Several conversations had broken out. Not the chaotic noise from earlier, but the purposeful, tight conversation of people who are processing something and deciding what to do with it. Nathaniel's foreman, reading the room, with the instinct of a man who understood when a position was untenable, had taken several quiet steps toward the far wall. He was not, Elena noticed, moving toward his employer. He was moving away from the center of things. That told her everything she needed to know about the foreman's loyalty. Nathaniel turned back to Elena. His face had gone through several things. Fury, calculation, something close to panic, and now something colder and more controlled. A man pulling himself back into shape. "You think you've won something here," he said. "I think the ranchers in this room have won something," she said. "Their own money back, their own records acknowledged, their own understanding of what has been happening to them." She held his gaze. "What I've won is considerably smaller. I've simply had the chance to say something true in a room that needed to hear it." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she did not expect. He laughed. Not warmly, it was the short, hard laugh of a man who is genuinely unsettled and reaching for contempt because it's the closest available weapon. "Your accent," he said, "is still all wrong for this place." The room went very still. Elena held his gaze. "Yes," she said, "it is." She said it completely without apology or shame. "My accent is wrong for this place because I was born in a different place, and I traveled a very long way to be here, and nothing about that journey has made me less of a person. My accent is the sound of that journey. Every immigrant who ever built something in this country once had an accent. Every family that now calls this valley home once came from somewhere else." She paused. "A voice is not proof that someone doesn't belong. It's proof that they came far enough to try." The room was absolutely silent. And then from somewhere in the middle of it, a single person started clapping. It was Tom Haverford, old Tom Haverford, who had greeted her arrival with crossed arms, and the word foreign dropped like a judgment, who had moved from the far wall to closer to the desk, over the course of one afternoon, who had set a plate beside her elbow at 9 in the evening without a word. He was standing, and he was clapping, and his face had the particular expression of a man who is surprised by himself, and not unhappy about it. Then Franklin Carr. Then Jean Delacroix and Marcel immediately after. Then Peter Hoven, standing very straight, his hat in his hands, his eyes bright. Then the man with the gray mustache, who had said no and come anyway. Then one by one, the rest of the room. Not all of it. Not everyone. The two ranchers who had stayed seated throughout were still seated, and they were not clapping. She understood. She held no anger. Change is not simultaneous. It happens in people at different speeds, and the ones who can't move today might move tomorrow, and the ones who never move are still people with their own weights she would never fully understand. But enough. Enough of the room that Nathaniel Brooks, standing at the front of a room he had controlled for 15 years, found himself standing in a space that had been subtracted from him by paper and honesty, and a woman with the wrong accent who refused to leave. He left. Not dramatically. He simply turned and walked out of his own meeting, his foreman trailing after him, and the door closed, and he was gone. The room exhaled. Then it began messily and urgently to work. People moved toward the document table. Franklin Carr and Jean Delacroix started comparing their receipts side by side. The man with the gray mustache, whose name Elena learned was Henry Boone, introduced himself to Peter Hoven, and began speaking with the rapid, cathartic energy of someone who has wanted to have this conversation for a very long time. Elena stood in the middle of it. She felt something she had not felt in 6 weeks. Not triumph. Triumph was too loud for what this was. It was something quieter. Something closer to what her mother might have called arriving. Caleb appeared beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. He simply stood beside her, the way he had stood beside her in the kitchen, in the barn, in the wagon on cold mornings, with the specific reliable quality of his presence that she had come to depend on more than she'd admitted to herself. Then he said, "You said what needed saying." "Someone had to," she said. "You didn't have to." She thought about that. "I came here to build something," she said. "You can't build anything on ground that's rotten underneath." She looked around the room at the men working through the documents, at Tom, arguing cheerfully with Franklin Carr about something in the ledger, at Peter Hoven, laughing quietly at something Henry Boone had said. This was the ground. Caleb nodded slowly. Then he said very quietly, "Elena." She looked at him. "Earlier, when you said there were reasons you weren't ready to say out loud." He stopped, started again. "I've been thinking about that." The room around them was loud enough that this small space between them was private. She looked at him steadily. The man who had not flinched at her accent, who had said, "I already chose," with the simplicity of someone who means it in every direction it can be meant. "I've been thinking about it too," she said. They looked at each other. The room moved around them, and the documents were being sorted, and Tom was being loud about something. And outside the door, Nathaniel Brooks was riding away from a meeting he had hosted for 15 years, and none of it for this single moment was as present as the 2 feet of space between Caleb Turner and Elena Varga. "Maybe," Caleb said carefully, "we could discuss it on the way home." Elena felt something open in her chest, something she had kept carefully closed for 6 weeks because she had not been sure it was safe to open. Something that was also, she recognized, the closest she had come since Budapest to the feeling her mother called arriving. "Maybe," she said, "we could." And then Henry Boone called her name because he had a question about one of the figures in the document, and the moment reformed itself back into the work, and she went. But she went carrying that one quiet word between her and Caleb Turner, like a coal kept carefully in both hands. Maybe. In Red Hollow in the summer of 1878, that was enough to change everything. The ride home from the Brooks Ranch was the longest and shortest 40 minutes Elena had ever lived through. The wagon moved at its usual pace. The horses were steady. Tom sat in the back and said nothing, which was unusual for a man who had just spent 2 hours being more vocal than anyone had apparently seen him in a decade. He seemed to understand that the front bench required privacy, and he gave it the way. He gave everything without announcement, without making anyone feel the gift of it. Caleb drove. Elena sat beside him with the documents in her lap and her hands folded on top of them, and the word "maybe" still sitting somewhere between her ribs. For the first mile, neither of them spoke. Then Caleb said, "I need to say something, and I'm going to say it plainly, because I don't know another way." Elena turned to look at him. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, the particular posture of a man who can say difficult things more easily when he isn't being watched. "I have lived on that ranch for 8 years, he said, "alone. By choice mostly, and by circumstance the rest of the time. I told myself I preferred it that way." He paused. "6 weeks ago you walked into my kitchen before I came downstairs and made coffee, and you sat across from me at my own table, like you had always been there, and I realized that I had been wrong about what I preferred." Elena was very still. "I'm not a man who talks around things," he said. "So I'll say it directly. I don't want you to leave, not because of the ranch, not because of the accounts, not because of any practical reason, because of you." He finally looked at her. "Because of who you are, and how you think, and the way you walked into the path of a runaway wagon for a child you didn't know, and the way you speak to horses, and the way you read every ledger, like the numbers are a language worth learning, and—" He stopped himself, looked back at the road. "Because of the reasons I am not yet practiced at saying out loud." Elena looked at his profile, the weathered face, the steady hands on the reins, the man who had built 8 years of careful solitude and offered to dismantle it on the strength of 6 weeks. She thought about what it cost him to say that. She understood better than most the particular courage it takes to say something true when you have spent a long time not saying it. "Caleb," she said. He waited. "I have been afraid," she said, "of wanting something in this country and having it taken away. I have been afraid of that since the first day I arrived in America. It has made me careful." She looked at her hands. "But I have spent 6 weeks watching you choose to stand beside me every time standing beside me cost you something. And I think—" She stopped, started again. "I think that the person I am afraid of becoming is the woman who let that go because she was afraid." He looked at her. She looked back. "I don't want to leave either," she said. The wagon rolled on. Tom in the back said absolutely nothing. But when Elena glanced back at him a moment later, his face was turned entirely toward the horizon in a way that was so deliberate it was almost touching. The ranch came into view. The dogs came running. And Elena Varga, who had arrived in Red Hollow with a suitcase and a Bible and 3 coins, and a voice that everyone said was the wrong shape, felt for the first time since Budapest. Something that was not the beginning of a possibility, but the thing itself. Home. The word arrived quietly without announcement and settled in her chest like it had always been waiting there. She let it stay. The territorial circuit inspector arrived in Red Hollow 8 days after the Valley meeting. His name was Gerald Marsh, a compact, precise man of about 50, who wore his authority without ornamentation and asked questions the way a surgeon uses a scalpel exactly and where it would do the most good. He had been in correspondence with Caleb for 2 weeks. He arrived with a clerk and a set of blank ledger books, and the particular expression of a man who has seen a great deal of territory fraud and stopped being surprised by it without stopping being angered by it. He met with Caleb and Elena first. He read her 8-page document in silence, starting to finish without expression. Then he read it again. Then he looked up and said, "This is thorough." "Thank you," Elena said. "Where did you learn to organize evidence this way?" "I kept records for my family in Hungary from the time I was 15, she said. "And I have a particular dislike for numbers that do not add up." Marsh looked at her for a moment. Then he said to Caleb, "You have a remarkable person working at your ranch." "I'm aware," Caleb said. Elena kept her face composed. Marsh spent 4 days in the valley. He interviewed Peter Hoven, the Delacroix brothers, Franklin Carr, Henry Boone, and 7 other ranchers who had come forward in the days following the meeting, some of whom had initially said no to Caleb and changed their minds once they understood that others were standing up. He collected original receipts. He compared them against Nathaniel's reported figures. He requested Nathaniel's complete books, which Nathaniel provided under the evident impression that he could still manage the situation. He could not manage the situation. On the morning of the 5th day, Marsh came back to the Turner Ranch. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Tom had placed Elena's plate at 9 in the evening, where she and Caleb had read Nathaniel's letter, where Denny had learned to read by lamplight, and he told them what he had found. The fraud was larger than Elena's 8-page document had shown. It was not 2 years. It was closer to 4. It extended beyond grazing fees into water rights documentation that had been manipulated to maintain Nathaniel's control over the northern supply. The total amount misappropriated across the valley was significant enough that Marsh said the word criminal twice in 2 sentences without hedging it. Elena listened to all of it with her hands folded on the table. When Marsh finished, she said, "What happens now?" "The Territorial Prosecutor's Office will be notified," Marsh said. "Brooks will face a formal investigation. The water rights documentation will be reviewed and almost certainly revised." He paused. "The ranchers who were shorted will likely see restitution, though the legal process takes time." "And the grazing permits for this ranch?" Caleb asked. "The ones Brooks threatened to revoke." Marsh looked at him steadily. "Any revocation made under the circumstances we've documented would itself be subject to investigation," he said. "I would not expect that threat to be acted upon." Caleb nodded once. Elena looked at Marsh directly. "I want to ask you something." "Ask it." "The complaint that was filed against me, the residency complaint, is it fully resolved?" Marsh reached into his briefcase and produced a single page, which he slid across the table. "Dismissed entirely," he said. "It should never have been filed." The attorney who reviewed it noted that it was constructed specifically to create pressure rather than to address any genuine legal concern. He paused. "The individual who prepared the filing is known to us. He is among the matters under review." Elena picked up the page. "Read it. Set it down." "Thank you," she said. It was a simple thing to say. But she said it the way you say something when you mean it in every direction at once, for the document, for the conversation, for the 4 days of work, for being the kind of man who noticed thoroughness and said so. After Marsh left, the kitchen was quiet for a long moment. Then Denny, who had been lurking in the hallway in the transparent way of a 19-year-old who desperately wants to know what happened but doesn't want to be seen wanting to know, appeared in the doorway. "Well," he said. "Well," Caleb said. "Is it done?" "The beginning of it is done. Elena said. The legal part will take longer, but yes. She looked at Denny. It's done. Denny's relief was enormous and entirely unguarded, the way only the very young can be relieved with every part of themselves at once. He grinned his gap-toothed grin and disappeared back down the hallway. And a moment later, they heard him telling Cole something in the excited fragments of someone who has been waiting to deliver news. Tom Haverford came in from outside. He had been doing something with the fence near the barn. Elena suspected the fence did not actually need anything done to it, and that Tom had simply needed to be within hearing distance of the house without being in the room. He came in and poured himself water and stood at the counter with his back to them, the way he stood when he was working up to something. Then he turned around. I want to say something, he said. Elena waited. When you arrived, Tom said carefully, addressing the middle space between her and Caleb. I thought, he stopped. His jaw worked for a moment. I thought you being here was going to cause problems. I know, Elena said. I was wrong, he said. 3 words dropped like stones, clean and unhesitating. Not just about you causing problems, about the other thing. The way I thought about people who weren't from here. He looked at her directly, which for Tom Haverford was the equivalent of a speech. My grandparents came from Ireland, both sides. They got here with less than you had, and people treated them the way people treated you when you arrived, and I... He stopped again. I should have known better. I did know better. I just forgot. The kitchen was very still. Elena looked at this man who had greeted her with crossed arms and the word foreign, and who had over 6 weeks moved steadily and stubbornly toward being someone she trusted completely. Tom, she said. He looked at her. Thank you, she said. He nodded once, turned back to the counter, poured out his water, and went back outside. Caleb watched him go. Then he looked at Elena. That's the most he's said about his family in 8 years, he said. I know, she said. How do you know? Because it had been waiting a long time to be said, she said simply. You can always tell. He looked at her with the expression she had learned was his version of open. The slight softening around the eyes. The quality of attention that meant he was not performing listening, but actually doing it. What do you want to do now? He asked. Not about the case, not about the ranch, about everything. She thought about it honestly. I want to teach, she said. There are children in this valley, immigrant children whose parents came from somewhere else who are falling behind because they're trying to learn in a language that no one is teaching them carefully. She had been thinking about this for weeks, had been watching it take shape in her mind, the way the evidence in the ledgers had taken shape, one observation at a time, until the pattern was undeniable. And there are children whose parents have been here their whole lives, who have never heard a word of Hungarian or Dutch or French, and who think that people who speak those languages are somehow less. Both groups need the same thing. Which is, Caleb asked. To be in a room together, she said, learning something, from the same person, at the same table. He was quiet for a moment. That's going to take a building, he said. A small one would do. I know a man who builds things, he said. Swede used to work construction before he came to ranching. He'd do it on weekends if you asked him right. Elena looked at him. You've already thought about this, she said. I've been watching you think about it for 2 weeks, he said. It wasn't hard to see where you were going. She felt the warmth of that being seen, not because she had performed herself clearly, but because someone had paid genuine attention. She had not had that in a very long time. She had not known how much she missed it until she had it. The first parents' meeting happened 3 weeks later in the main room of the Turner Ranch House. 11 families came. 6 of them immigrant families, Hungarian, Dutch, French, Creole, Swedish, Irish, and 5 families who had been in Montana for 2 or 3 generations and who came. Elena suspected partly from curiosity, and partly because Franklin Carr had told them it was worth coming, and Franklin Carr was a man people listened to now that Nathaniel was no longer in the room. Elena stood at the front of her own kitchen and looked at 22 parents and 16 children and said in the clearest voice she had, I am going to teach your children to read and to count and to think. I am going to do it in English, and I am sometimes going to do it in other languages, because knowing more than one language is not a confusion. It is a gift. She looked at the room. If that is acceptable to you, we begin next Monday. The room agreed. Not unanimously. A woman near the back said she wasn't sure about the other languages, and Elena thanked her for her honesty and said the door would remain open if she changed her mind. Two fathers conferred quietly and then nodded. Peter Hoven's granddaughter, who was 7 and had been sitting in absolute stillness with enormous eyes the entire time, suddenly put up her hand. "Will you teach us your language?" she asked Elena. "Yes," Elena said, "if you want to learn." The child looked at her grandfather, who looked back at her with the expression of a man watching something he did not expect to outlive. "I want to learn," the girl said. The school began the following Monday in a borrowed room at the back of the general store. Harrison Farley had been among the first people to approach Elena after the territorial inspector's visit, and he had been, if not warm, at least genuine. He offered the room without making a production of it, and Elena accepted, without making him feel the weight of what had happened before. That was how she chose to move forward. Not erasing what had happened, not pretending, simply choosing each day which direction to walk. Swede started building 3 weeks after that. A small structure, 1 room, 4 windows, a proper door. He worked on weekends the way Caleb had said, and Cole helped, and Denny helped with enormous enthusiasm and considerably less skill, and Tom Haverford came on the second Saturday and stood watching for approximately 10 minutes before he picked up a hammer and joined in without a word. Jean Delacroix sent lumber. Peter Hoven sent his son and 2 able-bodied grandsons for 1 full weekend. Henry Boone, the man who had said no and come anyway, sent money for glass for the windows and a note that said simply, "I should have stood up sooner." Elena kept the note. She kept it in the Bible with her mother's handwriting and the ledger pages that had started everything. The schoolhouse was finished on a Saturday in late October, 6 weeks before the first snow. Elena stood inside it for the first time after the last nail was in, and the windows were set, and the door hung clean on its hinges. And she was alone in the room for a few minutes before everyone came in to see it, and she stood very still and listened to the silence. A room. Built by different hands from different places for different children. She thought about the platform at Red Hollow Station, the 3 coins, the note under the door, the meeting at the Brooks Ranch. She thought about Peter Hoven standing slowly with his receipts. She thought about Tom Haverford's 3 words, "I was wrong." She thought about a quiet cowboy saying you didn't scare those horses in a voice that meant considerably more than horses. The door opened behind her. Caleb came in. He looked at the room, at the ceiling, the windows, the space where desks would go, and then he looked at her. "It's good," he said. "It's very good," she agreed. He stood beside her in the middle of the empty room. They were quiet for a moment in the particular way they were quiet together, not the absence of words, but the presence of understanding. Then Caleb said, "I want to ask you something." She turned to look at him. "I am not a man who makes speeches," he said. "You know that by now." "I know that, and I am not going to make one now." He reached into his coat pocket and produced something small, a ring, simple silver, the kind made by a craftsman in a small town who understood that a thing didn't have to be elaborate to be honest. He held it in his palm, not down on one knee, not performing the moment, just holding it the way he held everything, straightforwardly, with complete seriousness. "I would like you to stay. Not because of the ranch, not because of the school, because of the reasons I told you on the wagon that first afternoon going home, and all the reasons that have been added to those since." He looked at her directly. "Will you marry me, Elena?" She looked at the ring. She looked at him. She thought about her mother's voice saying, "You are not lost, you are arriving." She thought about what arriving meant, not landing in a place, but becoming part of it, letting it become part of you, building something that has your shape in it. She thought about all the closed doors, the 3 coins, the woman in the dress shop, the note in block letters. And then she thought about a man who had not flinched, who had said "I already chose," who had stood at a door when a foreman moved and not moved himself, who had listened to 8 years of his own solitude and decided at the right moment to end it. "Yes," she said. No hesitation, no performance. Just the word, clear and complete the way she said everything when she meant it entirely. He put the ring on her finger. His hands were steady. They were always steady. She put her free hand over his and held it there for a moment. Then Tom Haverford opened the schoolhouse door and looked in and said, "Are we doing this, or are we standing in an empty room all day?" And behind him was Denny, with his gap-toothed grin, and Cole with his quiet dignity, and Swede who had built the walls around them, and Jean and Marcel Delacroix, and Peter Hoven with his granddaughter on his shoulders, and Franklin Carr and Henry Boone, and 11 families and 16 children, who were about to learn that a room could belong to all of them equally. Caleb laughed. Actually laughed, a real one, the kind she had heard only twice before, both times when he thought no one was paying particular attention. Elena laughed too. Then they walked out of the building and into the crowd of people, and the October afternoon was cold and clean and enormous around them, and someone had brought coffee, and someone else had brought food, and the children ran immediately in every direction as children always do, and the Valley of Red Hollow reorganized itself in ways that would take years to fully understand. The school opened on the first Monday of November. 14 children sat at the desks Swede had built. Elena stood at the front of the room she had watched go up board by board, and she looked at the faces before her children from Hungary and Holland and Louisiana and Ireland, and families who had been in Montana since before any of them were born, and she said in English and then in Hungarian something her grandfather had said to her the first morning he put her on a horse. "The most important thing you will learn here is not what I teach you. It is that you are worth teaching." The children looked at her. Some of them understood every word. Some of them understood none of the words but understood everything else. She began. Nathaniel Brooks was formally charged by the Territorial Prosecutor's Office that same November. The case moved through the legal machinery slowly, as such things always do, but it moved. By the following spring, 3 of the ranchers who had been shorted had received partial restitution. The water rights documentation was corrected and redistributed. The northern grazing permits came back to the valley under fair terms that were posted publicly in the general store window for anyone to read. Harrison Farley posted them himself. He did it without being asked. Elena noticed and said nothing about it, because sometimes the most important acknowledgement you can give a person is the space to change without making them explain it. By the summer of 1879, 1 year after Elena Varga arrived on a train platform with a suitcase and a Bible, and the wrong accent. Red Hollow was not a different town. It was the same town it had always been, with the same people and the same history and the same complicated mixture of good and bad and ordinary. That is the truth about change. It does not replace a place. It moves through it, and what it leaves behind is not a new thing, but a truer one. The school had 23 students by summer. 3 of them were the children of the 2 ranchers who had never agreed to stand up. Elena taught them with the same attention she gave everyone else. Their parents, she understood, had made a different calculation than she would have made. That didn't change what their children deserved to learn. Denny could read by April. He finished his first full book, a worn copy of A Natural History, in June, and came and showed Elena the last page with the expression of someone completing something they had once believed was not available to them. She shook his hand and told him to find the next one. He grinned and went. Tom Haverford came to the school one afternoon in July. Not to deliver anything, not to ask about anything. He sat in the back of the room and listened to Elena teach for an hour and then left. He didn't comment on it. But the following week he was back, and the week after that, and Elena never asked him why, because she already knew. Some people learn in classrooms. Some people learn by watching. Tom Haverford was learning at 63, how to be wrong about something and become better for it. And he was doing it in the only way he knew how. Quietly, stubbornly, with no audience and no ceremony. Peter Hoven's granddaughter. Her name was Lena, which Elena found almost unbearably moving the first time she heard it, had a gift for language that her grandfather said came from her grandmother, who had been a schoolteacher in Amsterdam. By autumn, she could write simple sentences in 3 languages, and she sat at the front of every class with the focused intensity of a child who understands that what is happening is important. One afternoon she asked Elena, "Were you scared when you stood up in that room at the big man's house?" Elena considered giving the comfortable answer. She considered saying no, which would be the version she could tell easily. Instead, she said very much. Lena thought about this. But you did it anyway. Yes. Why? Elena looked at her for a moment. At this 7-year-old girl with her grandfather's serious eyes and her grandmother's gift for language, and a future that would be larger than it would have been without a particular series of choices made by people who were afraid and did things anyway. Because, Elena said, something else was more important than the fear. What was more important? Elena looked around the room. At the desks Swede built. At the windows with Henry Boone's glass. At the door that Caleb had helped hang. At the children from 11 different families learning the same things at the same table. This, she said simply. Lena looked around the room too, taking it in with the serious, complete attention that children give to things when they know they're supposed to understand them. Then she turned back to her slate and continued her writing. Years later, when people across Montana told the story of the Valley meeting, and the woman with the documents and the fraudulent grazing fees, they told it as a story about justice, which it was. And sometimes they told it as a love story, which it also was. And sometimes people remembered the school and the 23 children and the sound of 3 languages at recess, and they told it as a story about community, which it was too. But the people who had been in the room, who had watched a woman walk to the center of a hostile space with 8 pages of honest numbers and a voice shaped by a country no one in that room had ever visited. Those people knew the story was about something simpler and harder than any of those things. It was about what a person is worth when they are stripped of every advantage except the truth. It was about what happens when someone refuses to let a door stay closed simply because it was closed at them. It was about a quiet cowboy who heard something in a voice that everyone else had decided was wrong, and who was right about what he heard, and who never once, from the first moment to the last, asked Elena Varga to be anything other than exactly who she was. On a cold morning in December of 1879, Caleb and Elena sat at the kitchen table of the ranch that was now entirely unquestionably in every way that mattered hers too. Tom was outside. Denny was in the barn. The school was closed for the week. Snow had come down overnight and settled over the valley with the particular silence that deep snow creates, the sense that the world has been made quieter on purpose. Elena had her coffee. Caleb had his. Between them on the table was a letter from her cousin in Chicago, who had heard the story through several hands and written to say he was proud of her, and that her mother, could she see it, would be proud too. Elena read the letter and set it down and was quiet for a moment. Then she opened the Bible to the first page and read her mother's handwriting one more time. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that something else is more important. She closed the Bible. Caleb watched her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She looked at him across the table, at the man who had said you didn't scare those horses and meant everything else by it. At the ranch that had been built out of 8 years of solitude and then in 6 weeks opened like a hand unclenching. She thought about all of it. The platform, the coins, the notes, the meeting, the ring, the school. Lena's serious eyes. Tom's 3 words. A room built by 12 pairs of hands from 5 different countries. "I'm thinking," Elena said, "that I have arrived." She said it quietly, completely, without apology or explanation or the particular held breath quality of someone waiting to have the thing they named taken away. She had arrived, and nobody, not Nathaniel Brooks, not a land office complaint, not a note in block letters slipped under a door in the dark, had been able to make that less true. Because a voice is not made wrong by the shape of the mouth that formed it, and a person is not made small by the distance they traveled to be here. And the woman whose accent made an entire town turn away had in the end built the very room where their children came to listen and learn to love the sound of a world that was